Welcome to the Methusalem Podcast, the podcast all about new advancements in science and longevity. My guest today is Niklas Anzinger. He's the founder and CEO of Infinita City, formerly Vitalia. He has more than 10 years of experience in venture capital, startups, and regulatory innovation. And he's also the host of the Stranded Technology Podcast. I'm pleased to be here with you at Infinita City in beautiful Roatán, Honduras today.
Fantastic to be here. Thanks for having me, Ludwig.
So, except what I just said, what else should the listener know about you?
Yeah, so many people don't necessarily know I started my career actually in public policy, right? So I studied philosophy and economics, nothing related to medical sciences or biotech. And I realized after I did some internships in Washington, D.C. and public sector management consulting in Berlin, in Germany, so, okay, you can change the system from the inside. It just doesn't work. So that's when I went on to build startups and tech companies. For about 5 years, I was in the Berlin startup scene as an operator. And then about 5 years ago, my journey started to become my own founder that ultimately led me here to do what I do now.
So now here today, it's really beautiful outside. We're in Próspera, which is on an island called Roatán in Honduras. So what got you here? What is even Próspera? How did it get started?
Yeah, so we're in Próspera. Próspera is a startup city, a special jurisdiction, special economic zone within the country of Honduras. So think of Dubai and its special economic zone model, and it wants to be sort of a Dubai for Latin America. That's Próspera. And I was attracted to come to Próspera about 4 years ago when I read about it in an article by a blogger called Scott Alexander. And I was especially intrigued by it because of the ideas around legal innovation. Right, so at the time, I was already kind of searching what would I do as a founder. And my background was in B2B and in analytics. And I was looking into healthcare when COVID started because, hey, what if we have all this great science and technology? What are the problems? And when I did sort of a deep dive, my analysis was the science and technology is actually not the bottleneck. We actually could be living 10 to 20 years into the future. The problem is actually the FDA and medical authorities and how medical regulation is done in most countries around the world. And I didn't see really anything you could do about that because I learned before in my policy career that you can't really change these things at the policy level. Or if you do, things still get worse, right? So, for example, PDUFA reform by the FDA in 1992 was fighting a drug lag because things took way too long. And then they said, okay, now you can just pay for expedited approval, right? So to get prioritized meetings, which makes sense from market logic, right? This way you clearing a backlog or a waiting line. But the problem is now there's actually now more a direct payment modality by the pharma industry to the FDA, right? So that also didn't solve the problem. And that's when I learned about Próspera. I was like, hey, we're trying something new. Like we have the ability to develop a new legal system with some limitations, right? So within the Honduran zone system, Próspera needs to follow Honduran criminal law and immigration law, but it can create its own business law, right? Its own business registry, its own medical services regulation, its own financial services regulation. It can do its own taxes, its own labor law, right? So a lot is possible with that, and that inspired me. Especially with the possibility of what it could mean for technology and later especially biotechnology and longevity and solving some of the problems we're facing. So my core thesis is that the biggest bottleneck in longevity is not the science, it's an important part to figure out, but it's actually the regulation and how we get it to market.
That's fascinating. So you already came with this strong focus on biotech, maybe even longevity, which I want to talk more about in a bit. I'm someone who actually does know very little or almost nothing about all these network states, charter cities, etc. So there's a lot of these terms. Maybe you could clarify for some of the listeners. Like there's this term sede, which is specific, I think, to Honduras, charter city, network state, special economic zone. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So I think what's important to realize is we already have global competition for you. As a resident that lives somewhere that they pay their taxes, somewhere they move their business to. most people, they stay and live in the country where they grew up in and don't leave. And those that leave, they realize, okay, you can get a better deal, right? So you might go to a country where you have lower taxes, where it's easier to do business, where you have better healthcare, better insurance, and things like that, right? So there is already increased competition for you, right? Because one, the internet, and second, transportation technology, right? So it's easier for you now to move elsewhere, and because of the internet and because it's harder now to seize your wealth and your assets. So this is why, especially people who are wealthier can move to Dubai and to Singapore and things like that. And network states and charter cities are basically saying, why should only rich people be allowed to do that? Let's create more competition so more people have the option to go somewhere where they feel treated better than how they feel currently treated by their existing government. And the saying goes, we want to make this into an industry. Governance is the service, right? So the administration of law, of provision of security, and of private property and things like that. This is a service you get from governments, but there is better or worse versions of the service. Like you can go to a place like Somalia or Libya and you get a very bad service where you don't have basic security or property rights. And then you go to Singapore where you get a very good version of the service. So how can we create more competition for these kind of essential services that everyone needs? That's the fundamental thesis of what you call network state, charter cities, or special jurisdictions.
And some of these, so as a German, it's more uncommon. But I think if you go to China, there's things like Shenzhen, Hong Kong, which are also in part special economic zones.
Exactly. So a lot of people don't know that China actually got wealthy through capitalism and through trying it on a small scale first, right? So they saw it worked in Hong Kong and they were thinking, how can we do this? And they were implementing it at a smaller local level back then in Shenzhen, which was a fishing village with just 30,000 people. And now it's a manufacturing hub with tens of millions of people living there. And they were realizing, hey, this works. So how can let's do more of it? So basically almost all the economic growth in China is now occurring in special economic zones. And that is because it's too difficult to reform the entire country. So let's just give local autonomy in the form of special economic zones and let them regulate their own affairs.
So yeah, that's super interesting. So these are actually really successful examples then of special economic zones.
You could also point at Switzerland in general, right? So Switzerland is also a more decentralized governance model. More things are decided at the local level. And the general thesis is let people, the closer people are to the effects of their decisions, the better the decisions will be, right? So I think that's the general idea. And in very large countries like Germany or France, when the more decision you make at the centralized level, at like the capital cities and for more people, the worse these decisions will be because it's one size fits all with very large and diverse populations.
And so we said basically already there's a strong biotech focus. There's also, I mean, a lot of these special economic zones here are tied a lot of cryptocurrency. Is that something you're strongly involved in? What do you see your role in with it?
Yeah. So I am a big proponent of cryptocurrencies and crypto technology. I think within the next 10 years at least, it will be probably a majority of the financial instruments that we use. That's again hard to realize if you grew up in one country and use your local banking system, because what's the big deal with it? But as soon as you go international, as soon as you have banks in other countries, or you want to send wire transfers to someone in Latin America or something like that, you realize how clunky the system actually is, right? So you have very large fees and wire transfers into other countries, for example. And with cryptocurrency, you basically have zero transaction costs globally. Like it doesn't matter whether you're in Zimbabwe or in Germany. If I want to send you USDC to your address, all you need is an internet connection at the point of transaction. And then, as soon as you follow certain rules, you has access to that wealth, right? There is no bank or no government that can shut it down. And that is a very fascinating technology, right? Because it gives the individual more sovereignty and self-control. And we'll still live in a world with banks. I think there will still be custodians, right? Because not everyone is willing to take that risk of self-custody. And when you lose your keys and things like that, people want to be insured against that. But it's such a high variety of use cases that we're already seeing, and soon will be many more financial use cases, even in mainstream and larger developed countries, will be done by crypto. It might often not even be seen by the consumer that it's through crypto. So this is, I think, desirable, and I think special economic zones play a little role in that, especially here in Próspera. But when you think special economic zones, otherwise it's actually not the most common thing, right? So much of crypto adoption was done in emerging and developing countries, such as Nigeria, Argentina, Vietnam, where there's a very real risk of your local currency getting inflated away by central bank money printing and things like that. So this is why these countries were actually the ones most pushing the crypto frontier forward, and not necessarily special economic zones.
And Infinita City has its own cryptocurrency. It's called Lives, like very related to longevity. What role do you see for Lives in this zone here?
Yeah, so we have a currency called Lives. It's the currency for longevity enthusiasts. So we saw a need here locally in Honduras to have a stable currency, a stable cryptocurrency, because there's a variety of dollars and lempiras, and there's a lot of internationals here in Roatán, and there's a lot of that just makes it that there's difficulties around that. It's also surprising to many that the businesses around here are actually very curious about crypto and about Bitcoin. Roatán has a bit of a pirate vibe, right? It has a bit of a unique and separate culture, and it was actually historically the setting of a lot of sort of the Pirates of the Caribbean, right? That's where we're at. So there's a lot of that sort of frontier ethos here. So people are actually very curious about here and are open to, and there's a Bitcoin education center. So people have been onboarded to Bitcoin and seeing it as something that they can use for their savings. So this is why, but Bitcoin, I think, is very difficult to use for everyday payments, simply because it's not stable, right? So when you're a business, you need to know if you can make your payday work, and you're often operating on low margins, so you can't have that volatility. And then you need a stable currency. And we said, why don't we do that, right? Because we are very crypto native, enthusiastic about it. We bring a lot of business to the island. So we develop a token that gives us an incentive to introduce or educate businesses on the island on using that currency, and also give it a name or a brand that makes more people curious or aware of longevity.
And switching a little bit to science and longevity. So I think you have like a strong interest in longevity, and you see it also as the next frontier. How did you came about this interest? And also, then I want to talk a little bit about your criticism about the current system.
Sure, yeah. So I was longevity pilled not that long ago, probably about like 3 or 4 years, through people like Sebastian Brunemeyer, Max Anfreit, and then during the Zuzalu community times. And that's when I really got into it. And it's okay, who's Aubrey de Grey? And I didn't know before that it was a realistic scientific or technological possibility to potentially have radical life extension. I think I intuitively always saw that as something very desirable. Like, I was actually watching a movie called Only Lovers Left Alive by Jim Jarmusch when it came out in 2013. It's the favorite film director of my father. So we have this tradition together that every time on Christmas, we're going to see a Jim Jarmusch or Woody Allen or one of his favorite directors' movies. And the story is about these two vampires that have, basic, life extension solved. And they're reminiscing about how it was to hang out with Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, and about like rereading old books. And at the same time, the story is like very humane, right? So one of the vampires, played by Tom Hiddleston, is very depressed and wants to kill himself. And the other vampire, played by Tilda Swinton, is giving him this speech of how he sort of the going up and down in life is part of life and what makes it beautiful and worth living. So there's this one scene that's the ultimate sort of 5-minute longevity scene where she gives him his whole speech about how beautiful it is to like touch grass and live and be alive.
Jim Chalmers is a great director. It's been a long time that I watched it.
Yeah.
And so with currently with the FDA to get a drug approved, it's a very long process. It also seems to get more expensive by the year. We have something called Irum's Law, which means basically that newly approved drugs, they get more expensive and more expensive, and we see actually less and less of them. And it's also hard to run a longevity trial. So, do you want to say more about like current problems with the FDA and maybe in what position we are here to maybe overcome some of these challenges or find different solutions?
Yeah. So this is a deep rabbit hole, right? So once you get me started, I can definitely recommend, I think the best work done in this space is by the Clinical Trial Abundance Project and Ruxandra Teslo. So there you have a lot more deeper dives on some of the ideas that I'm going to expose here. I've also been very inspired by Alex Tabarrok, for example, a George Mason University scholar, or Jessica Flanagan, Sam Pelsman, Mary Ruward, and her book Death by Regulation. So there's a lot of thought that went into these ideas. But the basic problem is, and that's kind of part of what I realized here in Próspera. So in any developed, sophisticated, large-scale market, you will have medical regulation and oversight. You need that for coordination of a functioning market, right? So, and the question is how it's done and by whom, right? So traditionally, regulations are done by governments and sort of to the original network state thesis, right? So governments traditionally do law enforcement, policing, security. In most countries also, they are the biggest healthcare spender through insurance schemes, things like that. And with sort of the lens of free markets or libertarian ideas and public choice economics, we think that's generally not a good thing. Markets are actually more efficient. And we just apply that idea to regulation, right? So the FDA is a regulator and regulations are important in a good service. You shouldn't like have no regulation overnight, right? So the question is, how can you do a better regulatory product? And the idea is, or the problem with the FDA is a monopoly, right? So if they're too slow or too expensive, there's no second one you go to, right? So the idea how to overcome that, there's basically two ideas. One is a bit more commonly accepted, and then the third version is the Próspera idea. So what's already more accepted and more practiced is that of private certifiers that are licensed by health authorities. So Dubai, for example, the regulator, there is a health authority by the government, but they're not doing all the work. They're saying we create a market for it and we give license to what's called private regulators. What are these guys doing differently than a Deloitte auditing firm of other businesses? There's a functioning market for that. People want the product. And we're letting them do that, for example, for hospital certifications. It's also not entirely uncommon in Europe in medical device regulation, right? In Europe, there's something called notified bodies that are doing this private approval. Although it's embedded in a regulatory structure. So it would be going too far to say there's a privatized regulatory system in Europe, right? So there's limitations around that. And in the United States, there's the example of IRBs, institutional review boards, which are also can be done private, for profit or non-for-profit, independent from the institution or within the institution. So this is sort of something that people know, and we just need to take this logic a bit further, and that's kind of what our Montana idea is also based on. Próspera goes a step further. Próspera is saying, why do we even need a central health authority? What we're doing is actually an idea by a scholar named Robin Hanson. They're saying, why don't you require these businesses when there's a risk of harm to unconsenting third parties, right? When it's typically like regulated, you require them to have liability insurance. Mm-hmm. What it does is the business then will go out and ask insurers to cover them. And the insurer will look at the business. Okay, what rules, i.e. regulations, are you operating under? I'm not going to let you operate without rules because I need to do this underwriting for hundreds of businesses. I need to have some predictability. and then you negotiate with the insurer what the rules are, right? So in Próspera, there's an easy way to do it, which is use existing regulations from top 30 OECD type countries, right? So the insurer will give you a very low premium because that's been tried and tested and done before. And there's also a process where you can have a custom regulation for you, in which the insurer will then charge more, right? Because they need to do more expert assessment and it's less tried and tested. So this way you price in, or you have a market system where better regulations succeed and become widely adopted, and bad regulations that cause Irum's law and hold things back, they won't be continued to be used.
Okay, let me try to sum this up a little bit. So right now we have like one central agency, it's the FDA. I mean, there's more, like, I mean, in Europe we have the EMA, then in China you have Chinese medical agencies. They might have slightly different regulations, but they're all regulated by the government. And so in some or all or most cases, we might be able to have more efficient regulations with a more privatized system that basically works on an insurance base. So an insurance company would be interested for basically not be held liable if like a biotech company has that insurance. So they would make sure basically that the treatment, for example, is safe.
For example, yeah. I mean, the short end of the story is that, let regulation be done by private markets. Right. So as this is very commonly and typically done in many different industries, the problem is just if the government comes in and saying, okay, only we are allowed to do that. That's when the product gets worse.
I see. So right now, like basically you're saying there's basically, it became a bloated system, the FDA, and it's completely overregulated, and the private market would work more efficiently in this regard. What are some maybe risks do you also see for a model like that?
So there will be, it won't work every time. People will be harmed in trials. People will also die, same as in the existing system. And the question is, what happens then, right? So the risk is, especially with what we're doing, when something happens, everyone will like shout at us and say, how can you do this? Like there's 100 or 1,000 times higher scrutiny on the innovator than on the incumbent, on the existing system, even though the existing system might have its problems. So it's very important for us that we do it very responsibly and sort of with a lot of actually the same or tried and tested guardrails. So we're not going out there and saying, let's do everything completely from scratch and completely different. We're actually trying as much as we can to work with the existing structures and ideas and just reconfigure them so we get closer to what we want. Right. So this is why we did Right to Try. There was already a law that's on the books. This is why we follow more the Dubai model in Montana rather than the Próspera model, because I think it's still too far out there and still needs to be proven. And this is why we also say, hey, at least phase 1 should be a requirement, because that is the main hurdle in terms of safety and in terms of first in human. Right. A phase 1 trial is not the biggest bottleneck for trials. It's phase 2 and mostly phase 3 trials. So the phase 3 trial is the really, really expensive one. So if you give me a magic wand and say you only have like one wish, or what's like the smallest possible ask you can make is have phase 3 trials not be a condition for pre-market approval, but have it a condition for public insurance and Medicaid. Right? That would be a very simple change that would have the biggest possible impact. And it's not actually that much to ask for if you think about it. Why shouldn't people be, allowed to use something that's already been tested preliminarily for efficacy? And you can say things about it. We mostly know it's safe, right? So we can already say a lot. And most drugs, we basically know what the case is after phase 2 anyway.
And there's, of course, also a risk of doing nothing. I mean, if you have a disease and you wait for treatment for 20 years and nothing is done. Exactly.
There is the paradox or the thing with risky action and risky inaction, right? So there is, I would say the uncertainty of survival in longevity or the certainty of death.
Yeah.
And I would always choose the uncertainty of survival, right? Because otherwise we're going to die.
Yeah, and right now, if we don't get new technologies, we're all gonna die.
Yeah, exactly. But let me point out that there is a risk of doing something outside of the system, right? So once you're outside of the system, when you're an innovator, there's not only you there, like the good innovators, but there's also people out there who are not willing to follow the rules of the system for other reasons, sort of for bad reasons. There is bad actors out there when you're trying to innovate, right? So the goal should never be to stay outside the system, but to actually change the system by sort of proof that it works and make what you're doing more mainstream, right? So the goal is not to stay some pirate offshore crypto jurisdiction, right? The goal is actually to build a credible pathway that can be used by hundreds of millions of people in the rest of the world.
And so there's already biotech companies located here. So there's, for example, Unlimited Bio, Minicircle. They're doing gene therapies. So it would be interesting to hear more about like already successful cases here. And then also, how can we avoid that it's not just becoming medical tourism where people go to get like stem cell therapies, gene therapies, and then just vanish? Because we want to learn something from this. We want to see if these things work in the end. So
yeah. So you mentioned Minicircle, Unlimited Bio, 2 major success cases. Minicircle doing phase 1 trials here and treating patients. Unlimited Bio treating patients. They chose a VEGF therapy that was already used on 10,000 patients in Russia. So it has a known safety profile, and they're repurposing it and using it for different indications. And also just today, there was actually a new clinical trial announced by Clothea, right? So having like a clotho therapy that's also going to run a clinical trial here in Próspera. So, which is very exciting, right? So Garm Clinic has said that there will be 3 clinical trials this year, all of them with X-Prize contestants. So I think what's really important is, as you said, what matters is the data, right? So I also, like after some conversations over the last couple of years, including with Eric Verdin, for example, who was here, the head of the Buck Institute, I would say we should focus or put more emphasis on the research and on the trials rather than in medical tourism. So I do think, idealistically, I think medical tourism, has lots of potential to do good things, right? So we know some of the stuff works and it's good, and it's a very good thing for a lot of people to access these treatments earlier or more cheaply than in the United States, right? There's fraud in medical tourism. Lots of the stuff that people do doesn't work. And so is in the existing system, by the way. There's lots of therapies and treatments done in the United States, even FDA approved, that don't work or have very marginal benefit, right? So this is not a judgment on the medical tourism, but I think for the looks of it and developing a credible jurisdiction where science is at the heart of it and data, I think we really should focus on the data, on clinical trials, especially phase 1 trials and first in humans. Like we're very close to the US jurisdiction, right? It's not too far, and I think it's a big hurdle for early stage companies. So let's do a phase 1 trial here, and then hopefully, and the way we're conceptualizing it in Montana, it can then directly plug into Montana. And there you can de-risk it further and get more real-world outcome data.
That's so fascinating. So we might have some listeners who already have like very innovative ideas in the biotech longevity space. So can you walk us through what would they need to like start a company here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you're listening, then I would highly recommend to start a Próspera company right now. Right, so you'll find a referral link hopefully in the show note descriptions, because if you do it through us, you can also get one of our Hive points in our Infinita wallet and all of that.
So it's very easy to establish a company here.
Exactly. So it is basically a process like in Estonia with e-residency. There is KYC. So this is the only thing that takes like 24 hours, right? So you need to be registered and have like a criminal background check or whatever. And then basically you're free to operate and start businesses in this jurisdiction. And I would highly recommend doing it because it makes it easier to understand what I'm talking about. So the kind of things that I'm talking about with flexible insurance and polycentric common law and things like that, these don't mean a lot to a lot of people that don't have a background or education in this. But if you incorporate a company in Próspera, you'll get a little background education with it. So for example, you can in a drop-down menu choose under which regulatory system we are rated under. So for example, like Germany or Norway or one of the custom laws that were created here in Próspera, you can choose in a drop-down menu, right? And there's no choices you need to make that aren't reversible later. So I think that's a very quick onboarding and then you have it, right? So the maintenance fees for that are not a lot. And then you'll get ideas of how you could use it potentially. And of course, then there's concrete steps like I don't like, so really start a Próspera company first. You don't need to talk to a lawyer yet. Do that first, and then you can talk to a lawyer, and you need to talk to, the Garm clinic here, to us. Maybe we have some other options how we can do what you want to do, and then you can get started on a trial or on treating patients here. It's still a bit early, I must admit, right? So it's not that there is like an off-the-shelf solution where you can get started right away, right? So we're still setting things up. We just came out of 4 years of survival mode, and like Honduran government had tried to shut us down. But we have now the resources and the long-term stability and security to make it into something that could work for some companies that are out there that want to do trials.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, registering a company is one thing, but then getting like a therapy to patients, that's another thing. So that needs to be coordinated with, so there's a clinic here called the Gum Clinic. What else? What other requirements are there? So you also said there's this insurance model. Is that in place right now? What would they require in safety-wise?
Yeah, the insurance model is in place, right? So basically, you choose from the list of regulations you're under, and based on that, the insurance gives you a premium, which, depending on what you want to do, I mean, you gotta say what you want to do, right? So there is some proactive disclosures kind of required. What are you going to do? And then the insurance decides if they want to cover that or not. They will probably do a background check on you and things like that. Based on that, the insurance premium it could be a couple of hundreds per month, right? Medical, after all, is a very heavily regulated industry. So it won't be something that's like free for all and you can start tomorrow. There will be a process to provide medical services here. What is definitely much easier than in any other jurisdiction is to have your medical practice license adopted, right? So if you're legally licensed to practice medicine in a high credibility jurisdiction, the process to get that license accepted here is very easy and very fast.
I see. Okay, just like to a little bit further elaborate. Let's say we have like some brilliant PhD student, maybe he has some mouse data from his lab, and he thinks this might cure a certain disease. Can he start here?
Yeah, he can. I mean, again, he has to follow some of the steps, get insured, and the question is who does the medical services, and the medical services need to be done by licensed professionals, right? So as long as he finds a licensed medical professional that will be registered here, that will be insured, i.e. regulated, and they're willing to do it, they find what he's trying to do credible, and then he can do it. The question then is, so imagine you want to do first in human of something that's not approved elsewhere, right? Then you need to be under a certain regulation. And right now the choices are basically that you get an IRB approval, right? That's one. So basically the IRB is kind of your FDA, right? That's the regulation that currently GARM uses, right? So GARM is basically your FDA. They have their IRB, so they have independent oversight, and you need to basically do the same thing that you would do for regulatory review in another jurisdiction. Hey, here's what it's doing. Here is the safety and efficacy data we have. And based on that, you get the yes or no. Or the other alternative is that's been pioneered by MiniCircle, actually. That's a bit more of a sort of libertarian, very strict informed consent regulation. So it's basically saying you're an adult, you can assess the risk for yourself, right? So if you say you want to do it, then you can do it. There needs to be a registry of your informed consent, right? So the informed consent needs to be quoted, registered, and has independent oversight. I think by the jurisdiction, I'm not 100% sure, but somebody needs to have oversight that you're liable to, and you can be, prosecuted if the informed consent wasn't done according to very strict requirements, for example. But then in principle, you could take drugs here that are not approved elsewhere, even though they haven't even been through a phase 1 trial. If that will be disclosed to you, these are the risks. With the exceptions, by the way, of psychedelics, unfortunately, right? So psychedelics are covered by Honduran criminal law. There might be ways around that if you're part of an official trial. So if you do it through an official trial, that might be possible. But just so you're aware of the limitations, because I get asked that question a lot. Can we do that here?
I see. And so these months of February, March have been exciting and filled with like a lot of fun games, also like really serious science. There was a biomarker summit where Eric Verdin was here. So that was super exciting to see. And next month in March, there's this program for basically people who are interested to make a biotech company here.
Exactly. So we have a BioHub residency program here. Will last for about a month. If you don't need to be here the entire time, right? So if you have very limited time, I would highly recommend that you come towards the end of the month, because we'll have the BioHub Demo Day on March 28th. And we also have the Liberty Acceleration Summit together with Patri Friedman. And we have very exciting VIP guests that are coming to that. So potential investors and VCs that will also attend the demo day after. So the end of March is really the perfect time to come. But you really should consider coming to the BioHub. So we, during that time, will have some sessions with very experienced founders. We do pitch and fundraising training with a very experienced Techstar mentor. And we do accountability sessions and things like that. So we make you pitch ready. And if you're part of that BioHub residency, you'll also have priority for the demo day, right? So if the more time you spend here, the more priority you have for visibility on the demo day and through our investors, right? So over time, over the last couple of years, there's been several hundreds of investors that are involved here and the monitoring what's going on here. So Tim Draper, for example, is one of the most active investors here. He did the last demo day with us and is now part of his TV show, Meet the Drapers, where all four contestants here made it to the finals, which was the first time ever in the history of the show, which has 10 seasons, right? So this kind of speaks to some of the quality of the startups or of the support that you could get here.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like some of the companies here are really gaining traction through the Drapers. Then Unlimited Bio tweeted one of the Kardashians. So that also made the news. So it's really exciting developments. So I kind of want to round up, and I want to ask you basically, if Próspera succeeds with what it does, and if it succeeds spectacularly, like how would the future look like in about 10 years from now?
Yeah. So Próspera wants to be a multi-jurisdictional governance provider, right? So in the ideal world for them and for me, part of what motivates me is I want there to be hundreds of Prósperas. Right, I want much of economic activity to be run by governance service providers for many different reasons, not only the technology, the access to health, and the innovation, but also poverty eradication, right? So at any given time, there's tens and even hundreds of millions of people that are not in an environment where their physical safety is ensured. Many of them have to leave their countries as refugees. Many of them are not able to work or have access to jobs that allow them to feed their families. And I think with more choice for them, with hundreds of different governance service providers, I think that is something that can lift humanity up, not only the ones at the frontier of technology innovation. I think that will long-term be creating much of the benefits for the rest, but also for the ones that need it most, that don't have access to safety. And this is why I think Próspera really needs to succeed as a 0 to 1 case. Right, so Honduras really, to me, has the legal foundations to create the 0 to 1 case, and Próspera is the furthest along there. Although the other example of another charter city of Honduras, Ciudad Morazán, is actually also extremely successful. Right, so if you're interested in charter cities in general, I would look up Ciudad Morazán as well. So Próspera is kind of a high-end technology and knowledge-focused society for educated Hondurans and internationals. And Ciudad Morazán is actually for blue-collar workers that work more in the manufacturing and labor-intensive sectors. So I want Próspera and Morazán and many others to succeed, to scale to other jurisdictions in the world, and there to be hundreds of others of Prósperas and governance providers like that have technology acceleration zones, refugee access zones, poverty eradication zones, and things like that.
I love this. This is super fascinating. I really enjoyed being here. on this beautiful Caribbean island and learn so much from you guys. So I want to thank you here for the time and the podcast. And
thanks for the interview. Thanks for having me. And again, to anyone who's listening, some of the pointers in this conversation, you should really come see it for yourself. Otherwise, it's hard to believe.
You should, yes.